I'm going to give it a good go and hope that you learn something about sport along the way. I think I'm here partly because many years ago I met Becky Ross. And we shared many interesting times driving highways in Quebec and talking about feminism and a little bit about sport. And many years later, here we are. I also have to thank Tracy and Nancy for their contact has not been through me, but a lovely woman who works for me named Bee, who has managed to fill in all the requirements that actually got me to the podium here today. What I'd like to talk to you about is what's happening in sport and violence against girls and women. And there is a lot. And why I want to talk about it is because what you are doing and what we are doing run parallel. And they should be running in a spiral. We should be working together, hand in hand, ending violence against women and children. And the sport world seems to run on the side, and I must say, embarrassingly, about 20 years behind the rest of you. You are the leaders, and you have shown us in sport which way to go on a number of important occasions. And I'm hoping by talking about the world that I know best, that maybe a little bit of the violence that happens in sport will come onto your radar as well, and that you will turn your wisdom there. It's called Safe Washing Sport, and the title comes from when you buy products in the market and they are greenwashed. You think you're buying products that are produced in an environmentally safe and sound manners, and yet there are no monitoring techniques to ensure that what you're buying is green. There is whitewashing, where we protect the walls of houses in Cape Cod from the wilds of storms and so on. In sport, we have safe washing. In fact, you're going to have the Olympics here in 8 weeks, and those Olympics are going to appear as the greatest show on earth for the 2 weeks, almost 3 weeks, given the Paralympics as well, that they're here. And people will not see what goes on to produce that show, that greatest show on earth. So sport is safe-washed in the public's mind. They think it is a good place, and that it's a good place for girls and women and boys and men. And of course, many of us know the stories along the way that would say that's not absolutely true for some who participate. It is true for probably 95, 96, 97% of those who participate in sport. But it's that other edge that we need to pay attention to. So I'm here to talk to you about my window in sport. Jan told you a little bit about my biography. You know, I'm an academic, but I've been an athlete all my life. Becky is a bronze medal curler. Oh, silver, sorry, a silver medal. And curling? If you have any idea how difficult it is to get a medal in curling in Canada, it's easier in other countries in the world, but it's a very difficult thing here. Any of the other of you ever participate in competitive sport at any level? For your schools, for your locale? Yes, okay. Any of you compete for your province at any point? Look at that. Any of you compete for your country? Okay. I was fortunate enough to wear Canada on my back. It was a long time ago, and it made me realize that I was an ambassador for this country. It also gave me a voice that I didn't know I had. I had the understanding of sport beforehand, that it was not necessarily a good place for lots of people, but I didn't actually have a voice. Once you've been to the Olympics, people open the doors and they let you speak. So I've been speaking ever since. It's the same voice, it's the same message, I think. I'm still competing, I still race, I still train every day, most days, about 6 days a week. Foolish life, really, but it's great. Okay, so this is my outline. It's just 5 points. I'm sorry I'm going to do PowerPoint, but it's the academic in me, you know. And I want to make sure my shirt matches the PowerPoint because that's essential, you know. Okay. So 5 points, one about the human rights context and its application to sport, in particular the Human Rights Convention and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The sport context, just one short PowerPoint on that. The violence context in sport and some of the landmarks. A couple of communities in sport that we're paying particular attention to right now. And the one we're not, which is Indigenous sport. I think this is the next place to go in terms of development worldwide. And then what we need to pay attention to worldwide. So that's my structure. This is what we do in sport. They're having a really good time. These are young gymnasts training in China. So the question is, does that represent violence in sport? It's not the same kind of thing that you're looking at in general, and it is the same kind of thing you're looking at in general. This image will occur to you over and over and over again. I'm leaving my presentation with Tyler, I think. Tyler? Yeah, I'm leaving it with Tyler, so if you want these slides and you want to use them, feel free. Is this violence in sport? Actually, it's likely not. This is just the rough and tumble of sport. And it's perfectly respectful, reasonably safe. It is part of how the sport is played. And for us, the question is the tension between these two. The tension between the really good parts of sport, that side of the medal that represents good and fair and equal play, and that's the kind of sport I experienced. I had a wonderful, or have still, a wonderful career in sport. I am so proud to be skiing up that mountain in my little black Lycra suit, right? And have people go by me and say, God, that's a 60-year-old. Yes. Well, we can do this. And the other part, which is the violent underbelly of sport, and that is where I do my work, which is harassment and abuse and bullying and grooming and child exploitation and child trafficking and all that stuff. It's in sport too. Sport is part of the world we live in. And as many of you know, the research that we do in the violence area is not well embraced. You know, there are people in sport who consider me the bad news person. I'm not the only person, but the bad news person. Oh, here she comes again. But you know, sport is going to be better because I and many like us keep coming back and coming back and coming back and saying, we can do this better, we can do this better. Sport has more promise than this. It needs to be a safe place for everyone. We can do it better. And to you who are tracking the storm, you probably have thought about this, but one of the storms you're tracking is the attention that is coming with the Olympic Games, the attention from the worldwide sex trade comes to major international events, whether they're sporting events or expos or whatever. And one of the things I learned along the way was about keeping communities safe, including the sex trade workers when they come here, and the people here who live here, the communities in which the sport events are being held, to make sure they're safe, that they have enough information, they know how to be safe. I was in Lillehammer in 1993, which was the year before the Winter Games there. Lillehammer is a town of 25,000 people. 25,000 people. 300,000 people came for their 3-week event. The information around safe sex and managing the sex issues around an event are really important to everyone. Right? I also wanted to raise that the Olympic Games are, in general, sites of protest. So there is violence around the fact that it is an Olympic Games. The games I went to was in Montreal. There were 8,000 athletes and there were 10,000 military people. It was 4 short years after Munich and the Israeli athletes. It was 8 short years after the student protests in Mexico City. And when we were in Montreal, there for the greatest show on earth, 29 African nations sent their athletes home over a protest against the apartheid regime in South Africa, and South Africa had played rugby with New Zealand. and New Zealand had come to the Olympic Games. So 29 African nations sent their athletes home. It is a site of protest. Those have a violent tinge to them that lead to understanding what's happening around the Olympic model of sport. So I'm painting the picture, right? It's good and it's bad. One side of the medal, the other side of the medal. Your interest, it's really important that you have an interest here. It is a public interest. We all pay taxes. Part of our taxes go to support sport systems across this country, whether it's the little T-ball game that goes on in Ladner, or it's a hockey tournament in Chicoutimi, or it's, in this case, you know, the torch run in Inuvik. It's public money that goes into those things. It is your interest. It is your money. And in this country, we have a duty of care to provide safe places for participation in sport. That's what we do. In my work more recently with UNICEF and the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, I've come across instances of violence that it never occurred to me. Do you know what camel jockeys are? Yeah? Camel jockeys. Little kids stolen from or sold by their families who are tied to very tall, very fast camels who race for prizes, presumably. And the kids are 4 and 5 and 6 and terrified. And one of the things that we've been able to do worldwide is begin to eliminate that because it is child abuse. It is in sport, and it is child abuse. Another one that came to our attention, and you may have heard of it, is this mega distance running by little kids. There was a case in India and a case in China of kids under the age of 10 running multi-marathon distances, like 50K, 60K, 70K races, and raising money, presumably for whoever their handlers are, because they love to run. So it's abusive. One of the other things I've come across, this one in my own work, is the exchange of athletes between coaches in different countries. So you're talking about child exploitation. Here we have a swim coach in one country who exchanges his athletes with another coach in another country for sexual purposes. Right? The law is getting there. The law is coming to sport. So it's given those things that I'm going to take you into the human rights context now. The human rights is the backbone of what we're doing in sport. There are a number of things that are landmarks for this, obviously, and many of you know this work. The Declaration on Human Rights, 1948, and its various signatories, and there were many more later. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that was mentioned this morning, 1979. The UN Millennium Goals, which were set just prior to 2000, and there are a number of goals that are to be achieved by 2015, including eradicating extreme poverty and hunger. And the last one, there are 8 of them, the last one is develop a global partnership for development. And you may have heard of sport and development, and that's the one that we seem to be most involved in. I'll explain that later. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, 1989, very, very important document. The General Measures for Implementation, 2003, is the best practices document, what the various nations have agreed to in terms of best practices. And 2 optional protocols, which means these are things you don't have to sign into, right? And here, look at the titles of the 2 that they have not signed into en masse, right? The sale of children, child prostitution, child pornography. Can't believe why you wouldn't just sign into that. And the involvement of children in armed conflict. This is the child soldiers. And then the most recent, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit as well, because sport is actually ahead of the curve on that one. Okay, so that's the context within which we're doing our work. The sport context is quite straightforward. Sport is the full range of, you know, your basic organized play at any level in any community around the world, to the high-level competitions that you see when you see the Olympic Games, Pan Am Games, Commonwealth Games, all African Games, and so on. The Olympic movement is obviously, it's more than a century old. It is the pinnacle. It runs in a quadrennial cycle every 4 years. And Lillehammer was the first out-of-step games. So it used to be every 4 years you'd have summer and winter. And now you'll have winter now, summer in 2 years, winter in 2 years, summer in 2 years. So it spreads out the efforts. And the International Olympic Committee runs the Olympic family of events. The international federations, and that's the last bullet, the international federations, like the International Rowing Association, that's FISA, or the International Athletic Association, the IAAF, or whatever, those international federations are freestanding organizations, totally independent. The only thing the IOC can do is say you can or you cannot come to our games. So the IOC controls the show, the international federations control the sport. So you may have seen the rub between those two when we were trying to figure out what to do with the women who wanted to jump. They got caught in that. The IOC says one thing, the sport federations say another thing, and there are certain rules that apply, right? We could talk about that later if you wanted. But the international federations rule sport. The IOC controls the games, okay? Now, if I can move you just forward a bit to the violence context, the violence against women and children obviously has been a field of study, and many of you are products of that, as well as the movers and shakers in it. The attention has been mostly on domestic violence or on physical and sexual abuse of children, the sexual assaults of women, the cycle of violence, and so on. You know of what I speak. The secondary focus has been on child sexual abuse, most recently on child sexual abuse of males, and where it's been institutionalized, where you see the abuses in institutional settings. And I used to work at the Jericho Hill School for the Deaf, right by UBC, and I had no idea that there was a systematic abuse going on at the time. I mean, these are things that we find out later and we think, why did I have my eyes closed? In sport, our research has followed. It's idiosyncratic. It's trailed the women's movement by a long shot. We do have an awareness in sport that the abuse is systematic, that it seems to be occurring over and over and over again. We do pay particular attention to individual cases, but we haven't yet moved to what is the matter with my sport, or what is the matter with the Olympic Games, or what is the matter with X tournament. We're still at what's the matter with that coach, right? We haven't moved. You all know that we have to move. Where we are moving is on the diversity of the forms of harassment and abuse in sport. We are beginning to move down that path now quite well. I have just a couple of slides on the gaps. Whoops, let me back up. Okay, the athlete numbers. Okay, on this one, these are what came out of my research. So you know kind of what I'm talking about here. My research and those around me. One is that more females than males experience sexual harassment and abuse in sport, at which point you might be going, duh. But we actually had to put figures to it. The Canadian figures show that 29% of athletes complained of unwanted sexual comments or advances. The Norwegian figures put this at 51%. Their study coming somewhat later than ours. This is everything from, you know, the little gymnast who goes to the bathroom and there's a man leering over her at the stall, or you know, somebody in a train station pinching one of the athletes as they go by on an international tour somewhere. We send athletes who are 10, 11, and 12 internationally to compete. If they were your children, you might want to watch that a bit more closely. The figure that sent waves through the press was the next one. It's 21.8% of athletes, including recently retired athletes in Canada, reported unwanted sexual intercourse with persons in positions of authority over them in sport. So this is more than 1.5 of your high-performance athletes who'd had sex with persons in positions of authority over them in sport. Obviously non-consensual, just by definition. More than 1.5. And think of all the high-performance athletes you know. You know, those figures that you see out there, advertised here, there, and everywhere. 1 in 5. This was the first study, the first quantitative study done anywhere in the world. The figures came from 1996. We produced the book in 2000, and there's been a plethora of work on this since. 8.6% report forced sexual intercourse. 9% report being sexually assaulted under the age of 16. You notice the numbers don't agree. You ask athletes in different languages, in different ways. Their stories come out differently. They're not familiar with the titles. You know, a coach is sleeping his way through a team of 14-year-old field hockey players somewhere in Manitoba, and it takes 3 years and one athlete to finally say, oh, that was child sexual abuse. Right? They're not there yet. You have some work to do if you have sport in your arena. We haven't yet got the titles, got the naming for some of it. 90% of the sexual harassment is between males to females, and it's mostly older males to younger females. The other 10% is roughly split between males to males, females to females, and females to males. So that number is asked for quite a lot. I'll just skip the last one here. Okay, the gaps. One of the gaps is gender-based analysis seems to attract resistance in sport. People in sport want to look at sport. They don't want to look what the girls are doing and what the boys are doing. They don't want to see the breakdown. Another is that sport is an unregulated workplace. We have people volunteering all over the place in sport. The role of volunteers versus employees is not well understood. People don't understand whether the laws apply or they don't apply. When they try and make sport safe, they simply say, have you been screened by the RCMP? Well, that's good, right? You all know the limitations of having a screening done like that. It's good for a very short period of time, and it only screens for some things, and it's no indication of whether you're a person who's safe to be in sport or not, really. There's a gap over the confusion about what is an acceptable relationship between someone in authority and an athlete. Well, I'm pretty clear and you're pretty clear, so I don't know what sport doesn't get about what's inappropriate. About a coach, spending a lot of private time with an athlete, treating the athlete like his or her own, possession, grooming, sexual abuse, and so on. It's all there. And this notion of groupthink, and this one's particularly damning. When Sandy sat here this morning and talked about her experiences with how important family is. In sport, sport is the family. And so it's very hard to speak out in your family about something wrong with your family. Your coach is the parent in the family. And when you do speak out, the other siblings, in this case your teammates, kind of get on you and say, what are you doing? You're rocking the boat. We're never going to get to the Olympics if you keep talking out like that. Leave it alone. Leave it alone. For me, there's only one road to the Olympic Games, and it's full of barriers. And the athletes simply have to get over the barriers. There's no other road. So we have to change that quite a lot. Some of the other gaps. Meaningful link between the violence against women and children outside of sport and those inside of sport. Policy effectiveness. We're big in sport about putting in place policies. Even some implementations, we're not very, very good at saying, do they work? Is harassment and abuse declining in sport? The diversity of participants, we're beginning to pay attention there. And what I think is the last gap there is the lack of serious take-up about violence, and in particular sexual violence, in our planning for sport. So there are no IOC people here, but I'll bet they didn't put sexual harassment and abuse top on their priority list when they were thinking about how to put the games on in Vancouver. I'll bet it wasn't there. In fact, it may still not be there. If it is, it's very definitely an afterthought. So what is happening in sport? I'm going to go through these. The International Olympic Committee, this is the good news piece. There's good news. The International Olympic Committee has a working group. This is the Consensus Statement Working Group. This is in Lausanne, Switzerland. It's the only place I've been where they pick you up at the airport in a limousine. You know, the IOC has a lot of money. You had to speak French to get to the IOC headquarters, but so the IOC has a working group. Canada figures prominently in this group. This group was the first at the international level to look at sexual harassment and abuse. And it's 2006. Like, where were they for 2 decades? Anyway, I was thrilled to go. It's like having all your Christmases in one year. You know, suddenly you've got people paying attention to the thing you've been, you know, slogging away at. This is Dr. Margot Montjoy. She comes from Guelph. She's a synchronized swimmer. She's a parent of 3 children. And she's on the IOC Sports Medicine Council. And she's our best asset. And you probably have never heard of her. And she is working at international sport levels to move the barriers. This is a formidable character. Doesn't she look like somebody you want to take on? This is a wonderful woman. Her name is Celia Brackenridge. She's in the UK. And she can, see the stop sign 100 meters outside there? She can hit that with a lacrosse ball. She has this, she's in the Guinness Book of World Records. She's the most capped international player in the sport, men and women included. She also is the chair of the International Task Force. Formidable intellect, great person, great asset. Little old me, you know, comes from army camps in Western Canada and now lives in Manitoba. Got invited along. Sheldon Kennedy was our athletes rep. We were very fortunate. Do any of you know him? So you know his name? Okay, so some of you know him. Grade 8, grade 9 education. Terrible experiences in hockey. Abused by Graham James from the time he was 14 until he was 18. It was an open secret in sport. Theon Fleury has recently, as about a month ago, revealed his story as well, and he has a book. Sheldon is a personal friend. I'm proud to say that I know some of his work and have been able to sit at the same table with him. You could do well to read his book. It was all a good time. This is how we worked mostly. That's water in those wine glasses. This is what we produced. We produced the IOC Consensus Statement on Sexual Abuse and Harassment in Sport. And the consensus statement is something that the IOC has agreed to. So for the IOC to say, for example, that they're going to develop an education and training program on sexual harassment and abuse in their sports, wow, that's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing for the sport world. Most importantly, I think, the IOC set the direction for the international federations. We have yet to have uptake from the international federations on this, but we're working on that. So the consensus statement has policies and procedures. It wants all sports to have policies and procedures about harassment and abuse. It wants monitoring of implementation, and it wants evaluating impact. 3 basic core things to changing institutions. Then along comes UNICEF. Well, I thought I had all my Christmases in 1 year. Suddenly I'm getting all my Christmases and all my birthday celebrations all in 1 year. UNICEF comes along and says, we have the conventions on the rights of the child. Are you interested in working with us to eradicate child sexual violence in sport? Yes? Yes? Well, this yes happened to be in Florence, Italy. Oh, eh? Oh. So UNICEF actually is a really good ally. They have a number of publications. They have outreach in their 5 or 7 regions of the world that aren't continents, they're regions. And they can work at the ground level internationally that sport can't. And here they were offering to a partnership with us. This one is on the implementation, sorry about the N, the dropped N there. The implementation on the Conventions of the Rights of the Child with, remember, the 2 optional protocols about sale of children, child prostitution, child pornography, and armed conflict. Notice the sport image. Sport is freedom, sport is safe. This is what I call safe washing. They hadn't yet talked to us when they put this out. And then the working group that they wanted to partner with is this one on peace, on development and peace. It's the Right to Play movement that you've heard so much about, and it's very positive. And the Innocenti Research Center in Florence, that's where we went, and the Digest on Violence. So that was, we brought the bottom part of that equation. What happened was they invited us to Florence. We got there, well, I don't know, on a Monday, in the pouring rain, just like Vancouver. The day before, the Sport for Development and Peace International Working Group had just left. We arrived and they said, you know, we should have had you two talking to each other. And from then on, we have, and vigorously. They have produced the general comments on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. This is not a sport image. Sorry, am I ahead one here? There. But on this one, they've used, again, a sport image, rightly so, for sport, recreation, and play. This is not our production yet. They still haven't talked to us, and they're doing this. This is using sport, recreation, and play in the name of development. So when you go into any community, including any community in Canada, and you bring in sport, it's supposed to help a place recover. It's supposed to help a place become safe. It's what I call, however, sport in a box. You send an Olympic athlete like me, who knows nothing about development, with a box, with a soccer ball, and some uniforms, and some handouts, and they go to a community. They don't know anything about the context. The people receiving them know nothing about sport, and somehow it's supposed to magically work. And I feel badly for everybody concerned because the potential for mismatch is quite great, particularly when you're dealing with safety and security issues. If these kids are child soldiers and along comes me with my soccer ball, you know, you can see the mismatch. The idea is good. The operation needs a whole lot of work yet. So the Right to Play movement is that's what I call sport in the box. It does have the potential for social cohesion. It will move us along. When we sat down with UNICEF, the Palo Panera study on violence, the World Report on Violence Against Children, had just been released. And we looked through it for sport. We've been working on violence in sport for ages. Where's sport? There were about 60 questions that were prepared by this working group. They went to every nation in the world. 157 nations responded. And where was sport? There were perhaps 24 mentions of sport, and they were usually in some title from some distant country which had a ministry called coal mining, transportation, airlines, and sport, or something like that. The word sport came up in peculiar contexts. In sport, when you looked at Canada, we scored 0. All the work we've been doing on child protection in sport is below the radar of the government level. We thought we were doing great groundwork. We thought we were really making an impact. Here we are at UNICEF and IOC, and the Canadian government says, sport? No, we're not doing anything for child protection in sport. So that propelled us into the digest. And we are, it's still embargoed. I actually have a copy in my bag. It'll be out in about a week. So we have the place of sport in the UN study on violence against children. We went back through all of the materials. We went back through all the country materials, and we combed out, and we have the picture of violence against sport at the high level. And this one we've been sitting on for now almost 2 years, where it goes through the UNICEF screens. Now on to something more interesting. Okay, so that's supposed to be the good news, the IOC and UNICEF and all the Christmases and birthdays. What are we actually doing? Well, in sport, we're actually making some fairly good progress at the institutional level in 2 particular areas, sport and disability, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered. Okay, if I ask now, do we have a sport for persons with disabilities? Yes, no? Yes, okay. Do we have Olympic sport for persons with disabilities? Yes, and they are called? Paralympics. Are you going to have the Paralympics here? Yes, excellent. Are they integrated? No. Okay. Next goal is to get them integrated. Do we have lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered sport? Do we have Olympics for lesbian, gay, transsexual, bisexual? No. Are they integrated? Do they compete internationally? In what? Gay games and the gay games and the out games. Okay? So integration will at some point happen. So there still is an awareness, but a discrimination that's still going on. Come on, switch. Okay, this is a good image. Most sport for persons with disabilities is gender mixed. Could be a good lesson for us. Nice family support. Just in case you think it's a small movement, the Special Olympics, and these are for people with mental challenges, is a worldwide movement of 2.25 million people. When we looked at the percentages of persons with disabilities country by country, it ranges anywhere from 2% to about 19%, depending on how disability is defined. There are over 30 Olympic-type sports, more than 500,000 coaches worldwide, 700,000 volunteers. It's huge. Paralympics, Athens had over 4,000 disabled athletes from 136 countries win 525 gold medals. In my sport of rowing, we have several events integrated at the World Championships in Eton in 2008, and we intend to be integrated as much as we can. This is a picture I took in Princeton in 2006. The athlete on the left is visually impaired, and the athlete on the right is what's called a trunk and arms only athlete. We have categories in sport. You may find this appalling, but there are the arms-only athletes, then there are the arms and trunk athletes, and then there are arms, trunks, and leg athletes. And that's how they're classified. So this is an arms and trunk athlete. The two of them race in the same race. Who won? Arms and trunk? Who thinks the visually impaired won? Who thinks the arms and trunk won? It was the visually impaired. Yeah. They're both out there. They're both racing. They both won, right? The race itself is incidental. It is very moving to see these people racing. The same as I saw a race, I umpired a race here, where there were 6 men in singles, and they were all over the age of 85. And they're out there, and they look indistinguishable from me and my rowing boat. They rowed the same. Amazing things can happen in sport. Okay, in sport practice, we still have a lot of things to deal with. We still have to deal with what the public has to deal with, the negative public images towards disability. We don't see ability, we see disability. The social isolation of people with disabilities. The reliance of people with disabilities on others for care. Imagine transporting a Paralympic athlete halfway around the world and the kind of care that might be needed to make sure that that athlete gets safely to the finish line is phenomenal. We better be paying attention to it. We don't understand the nature of disability and gender. We don't understand the lack of credibility that persons with disabilities sometimes receive when they disclose abuse. You know what that means. You all know what that means. We don't think about it in sport. Alcohol and drug abuse by perpetrators. This is where athletes are used in ways that are not appropriate, clearly. Ineffective safeguards. My clicker is a bit slow here. This is a wheelchair marathon in Montreal, 2008. Good, healthy folks, many of whom have traveled through a gauntlet of abuses to get here. So these are outside of sport, but they can clearly apply inside sport. If you think about sport and how sport is practiced, you may be able to apply some of these to the Paralympic Games. I'll just highlight a couple here. The misinterpretation of affectionate behavior. I have a couple of slides that will show up. Family isolation and stress, separation from home. A system that has long rewarded compliant behaviors amongst those living with disabilities. So if you've long been trained to be compliant and abuse happens, what clicks in? Probably the compliance. Okay? Now, this is not for every person with a disability, nor is it for every athlete with a disability, but these things are at work in society at large. They're in work in sport as well. This is a picture that was given to me by a coach who was very proud. The athlete is the one in the wheelchair. The coach is the one sitting on top of the athlete. Would you say that is inappropriate? Yes. In disabled sport, as they call it, they would say, no, there's much more touching in disabled sport. And I'd say, well, inappropriate touching is inappropriate touching. I'm going to skip that one. Okay, this one is, you can see the gender mix. There's a lot of good stuff happening here, right? It's the rough and tumble of sport. Quebec and Ontario, I don't know who won. This, on the other hand, is a little more touching than I'm used to seeing in sport. I'd probably question that. The two involved don't question it at all. It's not an issue for them. Their consciousness is not at a level where they would say, is that good or bad? The other community that I want to pay attention to is lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered. Again, this is from disabled sport. Here are two coaches holding hands, which you hardly ever see in public, and wheelchair athletes. Well, maybe you do see in public. A little more would be good. Okay, in the sport context, homophobia is writ large. There are the prejudices and the discriminations in civil society also occur in sport. The direct homophobia is the one that I've spent some time on, and that is where the athletes will internalize the homophobia. They'll be in the closet, they'll not come out, they'll refuse to come out, they don't want to come out. There's nothing in the world that will make them come out of that closet, because sport is not a safe place for them. And in many, many ways, they're right. You know, it involves keeping one's orientation secret. And if people do know, you run the risk of not being accepted. It's one of those barriers, just one of those barriers that they go around. How many of you think that transgendered athletes would be allowed to compete at the Olympic Games? Anybody? If Sandy here were an athlete, would she be able to compete in a women's event at the Olympic Games? Does anybody think yes? The answer is yes. The IOC has actually, who knew they were going to do this, has actually said that an athlete who is transgendered has no athletic advantage over others of that chosen gender. And therefore, transsexual athletes are acceptable for Olympic competition. We're still questioning whether you're female enough and you can compete in a women's event. There was the recent event with the South African young woman. I'm still appalled at the lack of privacy around an issue like that, for one. I have a card that proves I'm female. I had to get a card to compete at the Olympic Games. It's called a femininity card. Why are you laughing? I'm feminine. It is a femininity card, and I did have to pass the test in order to compete for Canada. As of 1999, the night before the opening of the Pan Am Games in Winnipeg, the IOC rescinded the overall blanket testing in multi-sport games internationally. So now you only see it on if there's a complaint or a query. But transsexual athletes can compete at the Olympic Games. That's a takeaway measure, eh? I love this picture. If you think about ice skating, the dance competition, have you ever seen two women ice skate? right? What I'm trying to do here is underpin some of the institutional heterosexism that's in sport. The competitions that are available to us are already sexualized. This was at the this is incorrect. It's actually the Out Games in Montreal in 2006. Okay, and it was a competition in ballroom dance. Do they look serious? They look pretty formidable. In the world of Olympic sport, if ballroom dance were to be accepted, and there is some question about whether it will at some point, you would not see two women of this high caliber be able to compete. So there's the heterosexism and what I call the hypersexuality that's on in sport. You know, I maintain that gymnastics is soft pornography for girls. For boys, it's not much better. And most of sport, which involves men and women competing together, has a heterosexist nature to it. The hypersexuality is the understanding that male athletes are supposed to be super studs. You know, they're supposed to be able to, you know, have women in any city. There's no sense that they might not want women, or that it's inappropriate for anybody to be hypersexual. Those are things that are not part of the myth of sport that we're trying to perpetrate here. We want safe sport. We want good performing athletes, not hypersexual, whatever you want to call them. And the last one there is familism, and that's the notion of family that I've already talked to you a little bit about. The notion that, you know, family is a good place to go, but in sport, the coach is the head of the family. And it brings in the whole incest dynamic to the sport context. So when you look at coach-athletes relations, you're actually looking at incest dynamics in some ways. As soon as it goes wrong, all of those things that you know so well kick into place. So violence to which gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered people are vulnerable in sport, many of the things you see elsewhere. I've heard of people say, you know, that coach is a lesbian, don't go and play for her. It's a recruitment strategy that people's reputations will be disparaged because somebody wants the athlete to play for them, and they'll use a homosexual, like a homophobic epithet to make it work. I belong to a rowing club, and every year they have an annual club dance. I've not gone yet. I would not fit. You know, I don't have a man on my arm. So the fact that they do an annual club dance has certain expectations to it. They don't realize they're being exclusive, I don't think, but they are. Just basic, simple practice. The second last bullet is the one that has caught a lot of attention, and that is the awkward travel and sleeping arrangements for athletes. We think athletes come in two sexes, male and female, and that they're all heterosexual. And so when we travel with athletes, we know that we don't put coaches in the same room as athletes. We finally got that one. Took us a while, but we finally got that one. Doesn't matter if you don't have enough money. Coaches do not sleep in rooms with athletes. And that not all the athletes, all the girls should be sleeping with the girls, and all the boys should be sleeping with the boys, right? We have to introduce notions more complex than that in sport. This is a controversy you're probably quite familiar with. The athlete in the middle is a transsexual athlete, male to female transsexual, who quite courageously competed at World Cycling Championships and you know, a number of competitions here, Canadian Championships. This is a picture from the Canadian Championships here in Vancouver. And the athlete to her right, who finished second, started an ill-informed campaign about trying to get the winner, the gold medalist, off the podium because she wasn't a real woman. The way this ended up was that it hurt both athletes a lot, and both athletes are, I presume, still competing, but now much more aware of the risks that they both take. It wasn't a good outcome as far as I'm concerned. It wasn't one filled with respect or notions of respect. So we continue to have a wide spectrum of negative experiences in sport that make us feel unwanted and safe, those who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered. Social isolation, dropping out, feelings of anxiety about the next sport practice and so on, they all continue. One's gender or sexual orientation or identity can be part of yet another long list of discriminations people experience because they're different. As soon as you're different, you become open to discriminations. It's just one of the many communities within sport that you're dealing with outside of sport that we're just beginning to get a grasp of. One of my heroes, Mark Tewksbury, gold medalist swimming, Canada, and he is the founder of the Out Games, but I believe he's also the founder of Oath, which is Olympic athletes speaking out for excellence and respect in sport. Future directions, this is the work that I hope to actually be able to make a serious inroad in, is change some of the myths around who are the sexual predators. They are not gay men after little boys in sport. Sexual predators are the same sexual predators that are outside of sport. They're after kids. They're after people who are isolated. They're after people who are vulnerable. And sport is a good place to go. I mean, if you were a pedophile, where would you be looking, right? So sport has to say, we have to keep our participants safe in sport. And pedophiles aren't outside of sport. Pedophiles are also inside of sport. We have to look at those who are involved in sport practice and name them what they are as well. The ability to produce an Olympic athlete right now is the best protection for a coach who is a pedophile. Oh, well, he's a good coach, right? So some coaches can proceed through sport with impunity because we recognize their ability to produce athletes more so than the kind of abuses that they have perpetrated. There are open secrets in sport that are not yet talked about. We have to look at how homophobia is expressed in sport, and some of that is about, you know, looking at two men ice skating together and two women ballroom dancing together. We have to establish baseline demographics for those who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered in sport. We have no idea how many people would want to be identified in these categories and what can be done to make sure that they have a safe and respectful place to practice sport, within sport. We have to look at the relationship between homophobia and other vulnerabilities. If someone is gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, and you know, has another minority characteristic of race or language or ability or something like that. How would they intersect, and what are the multiple vulnerabilities in sport, and what do we do? The bottom line is it's about inclusion. It's about getting rid of the Paralympics, having the Olympics. It's about getting rid of the gay games in some ways, and having integrated celebrations of sport with all of us, all in the same field. It's about eliminating those places where there is discrimination. It's my other hero. At the Out Games in Montreal, she was the co-host of the ceremonies, the opening ceremonies, and I have the privilege of reading the oath for the umpires, and I was accompanied by a very nice gay man who read the oath for the athletes. He was a francophone, and he read the oath in English, and I'm an anglophone, and I read it in French. And we had great hugs afterwards, and it's one of the highlights of my life. And Martina has biceps like you wouldn't believe. Oh. Okay, so where to from here? And this is my last slide. Where to from here is, let's face it, you know, sport has the same problems everyone else has. The second is, let's focus on it. Let's not face it. Let's focus on it. Higher, stronger, faster, safer. Higher, faster, stronger, safer. And finally, what we're doing internationally can be done nationally and can be done locally. You know, I encourage all of you who are in the violence against women and children and boys and men movement to link up with your sport sisters and brothers. You have a lot to add to them, and they have something to add to you. Thanks so much.